the headlines, it seems every week have a new story about athletes, male athletes, and rape at the college level and sadly and beyond as well. Our next author has written a book about that. Jessica Luther is an independent journalist living in Austin, Texas. Her work on sports and culture has appeared in a number of places, including the Texas Observer, the Austin Chronicle, Sports Illustrated, Texas Monthly, Vice Sports, Guardian Sport, Bleacher Report, and she is the author of a new book entitled Unsportsmanlike Conduct, College Football and the Politics of Rape. So, Jessica, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, first of all, tell us a little bit about how you came to write this book.
Yeah, well, the big part of it is that I'm an alumni of Florida State, and the only school I applied to go to, my dad went there. I'm a huge football fan, and in 2013, it was on my radar, this topic. There had been a big case out of Vanderbilt, also one at Navy, involving a total of 7 football players that summer, I think. And no one seemed to really care about it. And I remember just sort of being surprised by that. But it was on my radar in November 2013 when our star quarterback, Jameis Winston, it came out that he had been accused of sexual assault in December of 2012, and sort of nothing had come of it. The police had never sort of done anything with that investigation. And then that became a huge national story. I didn't really like how people were writing about it, and so I started to intervene in the conversation, and I have never stopped.
So what didn't you like? I think this is so important. It's such a critical topic, and there's so much that needs to be learned by us as a society that we don't seem to know yet. What was it that you felt wasn't being contributed to the conversation that you felt compelled to introduce into it?
Yeah, the biggest one for me is that the way, I write on sports, and I often consume sports media, and that kind of media in particular is trained to tell stories about athletes, to censor the athlete, their athletic ability, talk about coaches, talk about teams. And when a case like this breaks into the news and sports media sort of takes charge of it, they often censor the athlete in the way that they normally would, except that when they do that, it becomes a conversation about, most often, about their athletic ability, the impact of this is going to have on the team. It centers sport, and that writes out 2 things. It writes out often the violence that's actually been reported, and often the woman who actually has reported this. And those 2 things, I think, are critical for really going to get an understanding of what's happening and how to stop it.
Well, it's a really interesting point that you make, and we're talking with Jessica Luther, author of the book Unsportsmanlike Conduct. I think one of the points that you're raising there, and I hadn't really quite thought about it in these terms, but when an athlete is accused of rape, it is treated as an athletics story. So it's not, and then it falls to sports reporters, and as you say, it strikes me that's not their area of expertise or interest, and yet they're the people, and I would say also a male-dominated, even in the terms of journalism, which might be male-dominated in general, especially male-dominated field of journalism, that really, it's not something they have a framework or training to talk about. So what's the answer? And then I want to go back to college athletics in particular, but what do you think would be the answer for that? Is it more training for sports reporters? Is it something for the editorial desk to say this is not a sports story anymore, it's a crime story? What do you think?
Yeah, I definitely think more training. And it is interesting when a crime reporter gets a hold of the story, that the angles are often very different. For the Jameis Winston story, the biggest reporting came out of the New York Times. It was reported in November, it sort of died down very quickly. But then in April of 2014, Walt Bogdanich of the New York Times published this fabulous piece about what hadn't happened with the Tallahassee Police Department. And it was a very damning piece about what had gone on there. And it was just a very different angle to the story. So yeah, I definitely think moving it out of sports media is important, but training sports people to be aware that they need to pay attention to the other side of the story. And I always suggest that if you're going to write on this, that you need to remember that your audience is not just sports fans, that victims of this kind of crime and this kind of violence are going to read it to possibly the actual person who reported the crime that you're actually writing about. And I think shifting even just that little bit makes people more aware of the language they're using and the framing that they're doing on the story.
So now let's pivot a little bit, because you're talking about, in the case of Jameis Winston, the Tallahassee police, but it often seems when these cases come to light, I'm thinking of the Sandusky case and in Pennsylvania, so many of them, there seems to be a kind of, and we've talked about this on the program before, by the way, Jessica Luther, with other guests, that there seems to be a kind of web of collusion in college athletics that involves the college, the community where the college resides, and the local police department. That too often, if it's an athlete involved, they don't take it through the normal judicial process, but instead treat it as something to be worked out with the coach and the administration of the school. Is that something that you've seen in your investigation of this area?
Yeah, definitely. I think that there is a collective response to try to keep this person on the field. That's actually the overall goal of everybody involved. There's a deep commitment to these teams. College athletics is its own kind of fandom, because a lot of people, especially in these small communities, are invested financially in this team. Universities are clearly invested financially in these teams, but also alumni, right? So you can think about smaller communities, their reaction, but the sort of alumni base often has a very emotional response to these things and have a sort of ownership over this place that they love and this team that somehow they identify with. And part of this then is sometimes police officers are involved in Tallahassee. That's the case that I seem to know the best. You get, the investigator is also a booster for the football team, or a lot of these guys work security for these teams. They know the coaches and the players in some way before they actually get a hold of any of these things. So, for example, in Tennessee, we recently learned that there was a case where 2 players were accused of sexual assault, and a police officer called the head coach before they went to the apartment to collect physical evidence. And he called the player before the police went to collect that evidence. And that kind of familiarity is quite a problem. I mean, I think most people, when they hear that story, understand sort of the issues that come then when they actually go to do the investigation. So this is a common enough thing that happens in these cases that we should all be concerned about that.
So that gets us to the next stage, I guess, of this question. And again, we're talking with Jessica Luther, author of the book Unsportsmanlike Conduct, College Football and the Politics of Rape. So we get this situation where you have a college community that's cozy with the local police. There may be some sort of employment relationship there even. You have the alumni. You have this sort of boys will be boys attitude that can reach horrific levels. And then, of course, athletes can commit different kinds of crimes and benefit from this type of treatment. Then you get into the special category of criminal behavior that is rape. And then you're injecting on top of all of that issues of gender and perception and social relations and culture. So how does that exacerbate the problem? Yeah,
I think we have a societal problem. I mean, one of the things is that I've written this in a very specific lens, and I think there's a reason to be talking about college football in particular because of the sort of system that exists, the sort of moneyed power system around these guys. But we have a cultural issue with sexual violence and how we respond to it. And so because it's such an intimate crime, there's often 2 witnesses. It's the person who's reported and the one who's been reported, or the one reporting, the one who's been reported. And we have our fuzzy ideas about consent, and a lot of people end up sort of questioning what's happened. It all becomes an issue of whether or not this woman is lying instead of how are we going to respond to this kind of violence. And so when you had that kind of that layer on top of the fact that people already identify with this player and his team, it becomes a very heated conversation that is often very emotional, and it's hard to have, to really talk about the details and get at what's happening and how we can fix it.
And I would think you would add on to that all of the cultural biases that make rape a difficult crime to report anyway in this country, and you amplify that with the reactions you get. Oh well, he's on the football team. He doesn't have to rape anyone. He can get all the women he wants, or she was in his room, so clearly that indicates that she could only have come there for one reason, or those types of things too. I would assume that all of those make it even tougher, but is that true?
Yeah, absolutely. All of that stuff it always becomes a discussion about who's reported. And I think it's important to recognize that one of the struggles in this is that we as a society respond very poorly to people who report, and we're not very kind to them. So the media often protects that person, and they don't release their names, very little details about them. So what you end up with in these cases where it's a man who's been reported that is well known in some capacity, in this case as a college football player, you get this sort of, on the one side, you get a guy that everyone feels like they know in some way. Right. We have stories about him, narratives about him. And on the other side is this anonymous person who we don't know anything about. And it's very easy to write all these things onto them, like that they're lying, that they asked for it, that this is regret, that they're trying to get fame out of this somehow. It's very easy to do that kind of work, which is why I really think the media in particular needs to sort of push back on that in the way that they report, and to be very careful that they're not participating in that kind of discussion. All those things are in play, and they're all heightened within this particular framework because of who these guys are and that they play football.
And I always feel that that all makes sense to me. And I always feel when an athlete is involved, and sometimes other kinds of celebrities as well, I always feel somehow that people put these figures in their fantasy world, and it's part of their fantasy image of an idealized life. And so the accuser, when she comes into the picture, or he, I guess, there's a sort of instant resentment of, wait a minute, you're messing up my fantasy, you're messing up my escapism. So the rape victim comes into the conversation with two strikes against her. One, they feel they know the accused, and two, they're kind of ticked off at her for interrupting their beautiful dream about how they think the world is.
Yes, I think that's absolutely true. And I think I do seriously believe that a lot of people end up having to, when we really push on discussions of consent and what counts as rape, people really start questioning themselves and relationships that they've had and moments they've had where maybe consent wasn't as clear as it should have been. And I think there's a lot of really personal stuff involved in this conversation that's very hard to tackle because it is so personal for a lot of people. Yeah. And that's, certainly very true when, as you said, they have this sort of idealized idea about sport. Often it's an escape for a lot of people. They Sure. don't want it interrupted by these kind of real life things. And then for it to be the kind of real life thing that actually they might have, some personal relationship to, it can be very difficult.
Yeah. Can't I just have a peaceful afternoon and watch some football? I mean, I think there's that response. So, okay, in the minute or so we got left, Jessica Luther, what would you say would be a solution? I mean, these are our colleges and universities. These are our young people. These are NCAA. What's the solution here, briefly?
Yeah, I have a few different ideas. My favorite one is that we just need better consent education, and I think universities need to be doing this. But if I was in charge of the world, kindergartners would be getting consent education because we need to understand better what healthy relationships look like, and we can start teaching that very young. And I think as a culture, we really fail our children in this way and sets them up for these kind of cloudy consent moments when they're older. As far as sort of college athletics, I think two big things is we need to hold people that are in charge of the system that protects all of this. We need to hold those people accountable. So I'm talking about coaches, athletic directors, university presidents, people who run the NCAA. I'm kind of famous for calling out other sports media when they do a bad job on covering this. I think we need accountability that goes beyond the individual. perpetrator of the violence. And then the other big one for me is that there just need to be more women in college football. They need to be on all levels. They need to be in the administration of the athletic department, but also in jobs that put them inside of locker rooms, so that these guys are getting like full, they're seeing women as full people, not just some sort of idealized version of them that often is dehumanized within these spaces. And, it can't just be a woman. That never works. Like, we need sort of, I imagine like a fleet of women to sort of infiltrate college football.
We need binders full of women.
All of these are,
yeah.
all of these are slow processes, but I think it's possible that we can change this.
And maybe we can even use sports and the violence, rape and violence in sports as a conversation starter, which I think is what you've done, Jessica Luther, with your book Unsportsmanlike Conduct. So thank you very much for writing this book, and thank you for coming on the program.
Thank you.